will give an overview of the EXIT project, what the project has learned, and how it will influence extrication in the UK. Next slide, please. In 2018, a grant of £84,000 was awarded to the National Fire Chiefs Council to research extrication. The term extrication is used to mean the removal of injured or potentially injured people from their vehicles following a motor vehicle collision. Last year, over 7,000 patients were assisted to leave their vehicles by this process, which has been the gold standard since the 1960s. Patients may remain in their vehicles for an average of 30 minutes, as slow, careful movements are used to avoid potential spinal injuries. However, this new research shows that this may be actually increasing the rate of death and injury. The project was led by a consultant in emergency medicine who is also a professor of pre-hospital care and the lead consultant for Devon Air Ambulance. The project was also supported by academics from Coventry University on the biomechanical studies. The grant award of £84,000 is likely to be considerably underspent, as some partners have ended up providing time and expertise and resources for free. This project is one of only two we have funded which supports the safe system pillar of post-crash response. Next slide, please. The focus of current techniques when someone is involved in a traffic collision is movement minimization. The idea that spinal injuries are common and that a small amount of movement may convert an unstable spinal injury into a much worse injury has affected the way rescue services work and the way they are trained. These are very difficult scenes for emergency services, and the images here show, for example, a glass on the dashboard to detect movement, widespread use of collars, holding onto someone's head, a roof of extrication as current approaches. An extrication can involve trained fire and rescue personnel using the jaws of life, which is a hydraulic apparatus, and other similar tools to pry apart the wreckage of crashed vehicles in order to free people trapped inside. The project has questioned these current practices. And finally, the picture on the lower right is where an officer has offered a police car to a victim, and then that has subsequently resulted in a roof removal of the police car under current guidelines. Next slide, please. The approach taken to the research in this project is based on how decisions are made in clinical medicine and applying that to extrication. The stages of these are reviewing relevant scientific evidence, taking into account patients' views and preferences, and then applying expert clinical judgment. In terms of the relevant scientific evidence, the team have done additional work looking at the injuries associated with extrication and entrapment. They have performed biomechanical analysis to understand the movements that the patients go through while being extricated, and use specialist interview technique to understand patients' experience of entrapment and extrication, and then combine that information using experts from a range of clinical and operational backgrounds to establish consensus and deliver evidence-based guidance. Next slide, please. This slide further illustrates how all these elements of the research fit together to give a holistic answer to the question, what is the evidence-based approach to extrication? Next slide, please. The first stage of the project, the scoping review, identified several hundred articles which were directly relevant. As you might expect, over time, extrication methods have tracked changes to vehicles, and something happened in the 1980s when movement minimization became the fundamental approach. This approach is illustrated in some of the quotes here, and the project found no evidence to support or explain why this movement minimization approach has become the standard approach. Next slide, please. Interestingly, the project team found that a high rate of spinal injury, including serious injury, has always been rare compared to head, neck and abdominal injuries. It is not clear where the prominent worry about spinal injuries has come from, as it is not based on the evidence, and there is little evidence, if any, for an approach to extrication based on movement minimisation. Next slide, please. The next phase of the project was retrospective cohort studies. This is where a group of individuals that share a common exposure factor is compared with another group of equivalent individuals not exposed to that factor to determine the factor's influence. The first study looked at differences between trapped and non-trapped patients. Trapped patients were twice as likely to die. Mortality remained, though less significant, taking into account injuries, age, and comorbidities. The conclusion being that something related to entrapment means people are more likely to lose their lives. It found a low rate of spinal cord injuries at 0.7% of those extricated. Most of these also had another significant injury, mostly to the head, chest, or abdomen. The second paper looked at age. It found some changes with each decade, which were statistically but not clinically significant, and the ability to self-extricate was similar across the age groups. The last paper on the slide looks at differences for males and females when it comes to injuries. Women were more likely to be trapped and have pelvic and spinal injuries, but these were still low. Men are more likely to have head and chest injuries. The conclusion from these studies was that overall, only a very small amount of patients would benefit from the movement minimisation strategy. Next slide, please. There were 4 biomechanical studies. These looked at extrication with and without collars and instructions, and looked at self-rapid roof-off and B-pillar removal techniques. These movements were computer modelled and analysed by researchers from Coventry University. The study benefited from the participation of many different volunteers and produced well-powered studies. Next slide, please. A strand of the study also looked at the experience of people who are trapped. These were identified by Air Ambulance and Aspire, the spinal injury charity. These confirmed the importance of communication and connection, and has led to some suggested behaviours for rescue teams. Next slide, please. The final stage of the research was a Delphi study. This is a process where experts work through to reach a consensus. Organisations representing clinical and operational aspects of extrication each nominated a subject matter expert, and of these, each contributed anonymously, so they did not know who the others were. And they did that to vote and refine statements until they could agree a set of principles. Next slide, please. Here is a short 20-second video which summarises this presentation and the findings.
Okay, I'm going to try this. Don't know if it's going to
good
work. Can you see the video?
We've got a blank screen at the minute.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I think that video requires each person that plays it to have their own login, but I can send it round later. It's very short, 20 seconds, that condenses basically the content of this presentation and the conclusions that movement minimisation is not justified, and that self-extrication should be the first option unless contraindicated. As Sally mentioned, there's been quite a lot of media interest already on this project, including articles in The Guardian and radio interviews. Next slide, please. The impact of the project is that an evidence-based approach to entrapment using the best evidence and technology currently available is proposed, and the project team is working towards its adoption by national level stakeholders in the UK. Such an approach will reduce extrication times and, we believe, save lives. make better use of resources from all emergency services, and reduce the impact of collisions on other road users. Finally, we understand that funding opportunities for this type of research are actually rather limited, and so this project is an excellent example of what independent and responsive and flexible grant funding can help achieve. Thank you.